William always believed his life had followed a normal course until the moment he divorced Clara, married for almost 15 years with a daughter, Abigail, who was 9 years old. He thought the breakup with his daughter's mother was the end of a difficult chapter, but one that could be rebuilt. The marriage wasn't perfect, but like many people, William believed that routine and daily problems were just part of life, and after a tumultuous separation, he was now seeking to offer his daughter the most stable home possible. When William met Eleanor, it wasn't immediate. She wasn't like Clara, with her explosive nature and anxiety attacks. Eleanor seemed more calm, with a softness that soothed him. He met her at work, where she was a colleague of one of his friends, and soon they started hanging out, not expecting much, but over time, something developed between them. His daughter Abigail, who had been so resistant to the idea of her father being with another woman, gradually warmed up to Eleanor, and William felt a great sense of relief knowing that his daughter was happy with this new presence in her life. Eleanor had a daughter, Lillian, who was 10 years old. She was a sweet and polite child, but unlike Abigail, she had a more introverted nature, observing what was going on around her with a keen eye. In the beginning, living together was difficult. The two girls didn't get along very well, but William believed that, in time, things would settle. And so it did, until the moment he started noticing something strange. Small signs of discomfort from Lillian when she was around Abigail, furtive glances from Eleanor at him when she thought he wasn't looking. Those moments never seemed big enough to warrant a conversation, but an uneasy feeling began to linger in his mind. The fact that he was starting to notice these little things wasn't something he wanted to admit. He loved Eleanor and was starting to build a new life with her. He didn't want this to be disrupted by unfounded assumptions, but at the same time he couldn't ignore the fact that the tension between their daughters was becoming more and more visible. It was a typical Friday when William decided to finally take the weekend to go to his ex-wife Clara's house to pick up Abigail, who had spent the week with her. After a few minutes of casual conversation with Clara, he noticed that Lillian, who had already been with her mother, seemed uncomfortable, more than usual. She was fidgeting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the gaze of everyone around her. The feeling of discomfort which had been following him for days was now intensifying. William looked at Eleanor, who, as always, tried to be cordial and friendly, but also seemed to avoid looking him in the eyes. After the conversation with Clara and a few brief words exchanged, he decided it was time to leave. Abigail was excited to go with him, and William felt a little peace return to his heart. As he got into the car, his daughter excited beside him, he tried not to think about it anymore, but still, an unsettling feeling lingered. Something was about to happen, and he didn't know what. The following days were like any other, or so William thought. The routine continued with him working during the day and spending time with his daughter at night. He tried to focus on the small joys of life, Abigail's laughter, her fascination with painting, and the simplicity of everyday moments. He was happy with Eleanor, and things at home seemed to be improving. But the unease that had been nagging at him for so long refused to go away. It all came to a head one evening when Abigail, after returning from school, came to him with tears in her eyes. At first, William assumed she had just had a rough day, the typical emotional roller coaster of a child her age. But this time there was something different in her demeanor. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Daddy," she began, her words barely audible. "Lillian, she hurt me." The room seemed to go still. William's heart skipped a beat as he looked at his daughter, trying to make sense of her words. Abigail hesitated before continuing, as if unsure of how to express what she had been feeling. "She touched me, Daddy, in a way that made me feel bad. She told me not to tell you, but I'm scared." William's world seemed to crash around him. The air felt thick, the room closing in. He asked Abigail to explain in more detail, but she was too frightened, unable to give him any more information. What she had said was more than enough to send a chill down his spine. Without a second thought, William told Abigail to stay in her room while he went to confront Eleanor. He didn't know how to process what had just been revealed, but his gut told him it was something serious. He went to the living room where Eleanor was sitting, reading a book as if everything was normal. When he walked in, he could see the unease on her face. She could tell something was wrong. "Eleanor," William's voice was calm, but underneath there was a deep tremor of anger. "What did Lillian do to Abigail?" Eleanor froze for a moment. Her face went pale, and William could see her trying to formulate an answer. But none came. Instead, she just stared at him, silent, her eyes full of guilt. And that's when William realized that Eleanor had known something was wrong. She wasn't just surprised by the accusation, she was avoiding it. "Eleanor, I need you to tell me the truth right now. What has been going on?" His voice was firmer now, a mixture of fear and fury rising in his chest. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her chair, looking away from him. For a moment she remained silent, the tension unbearable. William took a step closer, his breath heavy, waiting for her to speak. Finally, Eleanor let out a long, shaky breath. "It's not what you think," she whispered, as if she were talking to herself. "But it's true. Lillian. She's been struggling. She's been acting out because of what happened with her father." The revelation hit William like a ton of bricks. Lillian's behavior, her discomfort, the strange tension between the girls, everything started to make sense. But the more he thought about it, the more questions piled up. "What do you mean, what happened with her father?" William demanded, his anger now fully taking over. "What did you let her do to my daughter?" Eleanor bit her lip, as if debating whether or not she should continue. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want it, but she wouldn't stop. Lillian was having problems with her emotions, and she acted out in ways that were hard for me to control. She did things to Abigail that I couldn't stop." The words echoed in William's mind. He was in disbelief. His mind raced, trying to understand how Eleanor had allowed this to go on. The horror of the situation settled in like a dark cloud over his entire existence. "I didn't know how to handle it," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "Lillian kept saying she was confused. She said it was her father's fault, that he hurt her, and she was just trying to find some way to deal with it." William stood there in shock, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. This wasn't just a case of a troubled child, this was something far darker, something that was shaking the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his family. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how." The room was thick with the silence that followed. William felt the weight of the betrayal hit him like a physical blow. He had trusted Eleanor, had let her into his life and the life of his daughter. And now it seemed that everything was falling apart. His daughter had been hurt, and the woman he thought he could trust had known about it all along. His mind spun, questions flooding in. What had he been blind to? How could he have missed the signs? How could Eleanor have allowed it to go this far without stepping in? "Where is Lillian now?" he asked, his voice icy with fury. Eleanor hesitated, and it was clear she didn't want to answer. But there was no turning back now. "She's upstairs," Eleanor said, barely meeting his gaze. William didn't wait for another moment. He marched upstairs to find Lillian, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was going to say to her, but something needed to be done. His daughter's safety came first, no matter what. And once he discovered the full extent of what had been happening, everything would change. William stood outside Lillian's door, his heart racing. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: anger, confusion, betrayal, fear. He had spent years building a life with Eleanor, convinced that they were a family, and yet here he was, facing the shattering truth that everything he had believed to be true was a lie. His hand gripped the doorknob, but for a moment he hesitated. What would he say to Lillian? What could he say to make sense of the mess his life had become? Would she even tell him the truth? With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Lillian sat on her bed, staring out the window, her back turned to him. She seemed so small, so fragile. For a moment, William felt a flicker of sympathy for her. But the anger quickly resurfaced. She had hurt his daughter. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. "Lillian," he said, his voice calm but firm. Lillian didn't turn around at first. She simply continued to stare out the window, her posture tense. William took a step closer, and she stiffened at the sound of his footsteps. "I need you to tell me what's been going on," William continued. "I know what happened with Abigail. I know about the things you did to her." Her body visibly tensed at the mention of Abigail's name. She turned slowly to face him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and something else, something that William couldn't quite place. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't know how to stop." William's heart tightened. There was something in her voice that sounded almost like regret. But he couldn't let his guard down. Not after everything that had happened. "Why, Lillian?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Why would you do something like this to Abigail? She's your sister. She's just a little girl." Lillian's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She seemed to be searching for the right words, but they never came. Instead, she finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to. I couldn't control it," she admitted. "When my father left, everything changed. I didn't know how to handle it. He never came back, and my mom started pushing me to be perfect, to be someone I wasn't. It felt like no one cared. No one was really there for me, so I started doing things to feel in control, to feel something, anything." William's anger flared again, but there was something else now, something he couldn't quite place. A deep sadness filled the pit of his stomach as he looked at this girl who had clearly been broken, torn apart by something that she didn't know how to express. But that didn't excuse what she had done. "Lillian," he said, his voice softer now, "you hurt my daughter. And that's something I can't just forgive. You crossed a line that you can never take back." Lillian's eyes welled with tears, and she began to sob quietly. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I don't know why I did it. I don't know how to make it stop." William stood there for a long time, watching her. He wanted to rage at her, to tell her how much he had hurt his family, but something held him back. This wasn't just a matter of blame, it was a matter of understanding. Lillian wasn't the villain here. She was a victim too, though in a different way. Finally, William spoke again, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'm going to have to tell Abigail everything. She deserves to know the truth. She deserves to be safe. And you need help, Lillian. I'm not sure what kind of help you need. But you can't keep pretending everything's okay. You can't just hurt people and expect it to go away." Lillian nodded slowly, her tears staining her face. "I understand," she whispered. "I don't want to hurt anyone anymore. I just don't know how to fix it." William stood silently for a moment before turning to leave. His mind was reeling with everything that had happened, but there was something else that gnawed at him. Eleanor had known. She had known for a while, and yet she hadn't done enough to stop it. The realization felt like a betrayal too deep for words. As William closed the door behind him, he made a promise to himself. He would protect Abigail, no matter what. He would find a way to help Lillian, even if it meant confronting his own demons. But the journey ahead would be difficult. Trust had been shattered, and the road to healing would be long. He returned to Abigail's room, finding her curled up on her bed, her eyes red from crying. She looked at him as he entered, her small face full of uncertainty. "Daddy, is it over?" she asked quietly, her voice shaky. William sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart, I promise." He hugged her tightly, holding on to the one thing that still made sense in this broken world, his daughter's safety and his resolve to protect her. No matter what it took, the days following the confrontation were some of the hardest William had ever faced. His thoughts were consumed by the events that had unfolded, and the weight of it all felt suffocating. He had promised Abigail that everything would be okay, but deep down, he wasn't sure what that even meant anymore. How could he make sense of the chaos? How could he fix what had been broken? Lillian had gone silent after their conversation. She didn't try to contact him or Abigail again, and William wondered if that silence was a sign of remorse, or if it was a sign of something worse. He couldn't quite bring himself to reach out to her. Not yet. The hurt was too fresh, too raw. Instead, he focused on Abigail, who seemed to be retreating further into herself. Every day he checked on her, tried to talk to her, but she was distant, always staring off into space or playing with her toys without enthusiasm. The spark in her eyes had dimmed. William knew she was terrified, confused, and heartbroken, but he didn't know how to help her. He had been so focused on protecting her from the outside world that he never imagined it would be her own family that would hurt her. It was on the fourth day after the confrontation when everything came to a head. William came home early from work, a rare occurrence, and found Abigail in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, scribbling something on a piece of paper. Her face was streaked with tears, and her hands shook as she held the pen. "Sweetheart," William said, his voice gentle as he walked over to her. "What are you doing?" Abigail looked up, startled, her eyes red and swollen. She quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand, as if trying to hide her emotions from him. "Nothing," she mumbled, her voice hoarse. William sat beside her, concern flooding his chest. "You're not nothing? What's wrong?" "You don't have to hide it from me." For a moment, Abigail said nothing. Then her small voice broke the silence. "I wrote a letter." "A letter?" William asked, confused. He leaned in closer, trying to make sense of her actions. Abigail nodded and handed him the piece of paper. It was covered with her childish handwriting. But as William read, his heart sank. The words were a mixture of fear, confusion, and pain, but there was one sentence that stood out among the rest. "I'm scared of Lillian." William's stomach churned as he read the letter again. The weight of those words hit him harder than anything else he had learned. His daughter, his little girl, was afraid of someone she should have been able to trust completely, someone he had once thought of as family. Lillian had broken that trust, and now Abigail was paying the price. "Daddy," Abigail said softly, her voice barely a whisper, "is it going to be okay? Will Lillian hurt me again?" William's heart clenched. He wanted to say yes, that everything would be fine, that nothing like that would ever happen again. But the truth was, he didn't know. He had no way of knowing if the damage had been done, if Abigail would ever feel truly safe again. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise you, I will protect you. No one will hurt you again." He kissed her forehead, holding her close, but the weight of his words was heavy. He couldn't protect her from everything. He couldn't erase the fear that Lillian had planted in her heart. And he certainly couldn't undo the things that had already been done. William decided it was time for one final confrontation. Lillian needed to face the consequences of her actions, not just for what she had done to Abigail, but for what she had done to their family. He couldn't let her continue to escape responsibility. If there was any chance of healing, it had to start with the truth. That evening, after Abigail had gone to bed, William drove to Lillian's apartment. The familiar streets felt foreign to him now. Everything had changed. His family was in tatters, and he wasn't sure how to fix it. But he knew one thing for certain. Lillian needed to be held accountable. When he arrived at her apartment, Lillian was sitting on the couch, her eyes hollow, her face drained of color. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "I need to hear the truth, Lillian," William said, his voice firm, but not without pain. "I need you to tell me everything. Why did you hurt my daughter? Why did you do this?" Lillian stared at him for a long moment, her hands wringing in her lap. For a moment William thought she might not answer, but then she spoke in a low, tremulous voice. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," she whispered. "I just didn't know how to handle everything. After my mom passed away, and then when my father left, I was lost. I didn't know who I was anymore. And then, when I moved in with you and Abigail, I felt like I was invisible. I didn't know how to get the attention I wanted. I thought if I could make her feel as small as I did, maybe I'd finally matter." The words hung heavy in the air, and William struggled to keep his composure. He had never imagined that Lillian's pain would be so deep, so tangled with her actions, but that didn't excuse what she had done. "You hurt my daughter," William repeated, his voice hardening. "You made her afraid of you, and I can't just let that go." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know how to stop. I'm sorry. I don't know how to make it right." William stood up, his anger mixing with a deep sorrow. "The first step is being honest. The second is accepting responsibility for what you've done." Lillian nodded, her face streaked with tears. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said quietly. "But I understand if you never want to see me again." The words stung, but William knew she was right. He couldn't pretend that everything would be fine between them. The trust had been shattered beyond repair, but there was still something inside of him that believed in redemption. There was still hope for Lillian, even if it meant taking a long, painful road to recovery. William took a deep breath and walked out of the apartment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The truth had come to light, and while it wasn't easy to hear, it was the only way forward. The following days were a blur. William had never felt so torn in his life. Lillian's apology weighed on him, but the damage was done. He wanted to believe she was truly remorseful, but the memory of how she had treated Abigail was something he couldn't easily erase. There was a part of him that still cared about her. After all, she had once been his wife, the person he had trusted with his life. But the relationship they had built over the years had been tainted by secrets, lies, and betrayal. Abigail, too, seemed to be carrying her own burden. Despite her quiet moments, William could see the scars in her eyes, the way she looked at people, the way she hesitated before trusting. Her innocence had been shattered, and it broke his heart that he couldn't fix it all for her. He had promised her safety, but how could he keep that promise when someone she had once trusted had turned on her? He tried to reassure her, to comfort her in the little ways that worked when she was younger, reading her favorite stories before bed, taking her to the park, just being present. But nothing seemed to take away the sadness that clung to her like a shadow. It wasn't until a week later that William finally made the decision to take Abigail to therapy. He had been putting it off, thinking they could heal on their own, but he realized that he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. Abigail needed help. The therapist they chose, Dr. Harris, had a reputation for working with children who had been through trauma. He felt it was the right step, even if it meant he would have to confront his own unresolved feelings. That afternoon they sat in Dr. Harris's office, a cozy space with calming pastel walls and shelves lined with books. Abigail, clutching her stuffed bear, sat quietly beside him on the couch. She hadn't spoken much since they arrived, but William knew she was listening, absorbing every word. It was time to confront the truth. "Abigail, I know this has been really hard for you," Dr. Harris said, his voice kind but firm. "And I know you have a lot of feelings you might not fully understand right now. But I want you to know that it's okay to feel scared, confused, or even angry." Abigail looked up at him, her big brown eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "I don't like feeling like this," she whispered. "I don't want to be scared anymore." William's heart broke all over again, hearing the words from his daughter. But Dr. Harris was right. This was a process, and they couldn't move forward without first acknowledging everything that had happened. "You won't always feel this way, Abigail," Dr. Harris continued, "but it's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of courage, and it's important to remember that you don't have to carry all of this by yourself. Your dad is here, and I'm here to help." William held his daughter's hand tightly, reassuring her with his touch. It was a small gesture, but he hoped it would be enough to show her that he was there always, no matter what. After the session, they drove home in silence. William couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. The world he had known, his family, his life had shifted under his feet, and he wasn't sure how to rebuild it. That evening, Lillian called. William had been expecting it, but the call still caught him off guard. It wasn't the angry confrontation he had anticipated, nor was it a plea for forgiveness. It was something much more quiet and resigned. "William," Lillian said, her voice strained, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. I know I can't undo what I did, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know that I'm going to try to make things right. For you, for Abigail, for myself." Her words were soft, but William couldn't escape the heaviness in his chest. "I don't know if that's possible, Lillian," he said, his voice tight. "What you did to Abigail. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." "I understand," she replied, her voice breaking. "But I'm going to try. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I have to make it right, even if that means walking away. I've been so selfish, and I know I can't undo it." The silence between them felt deafening. William didn't know how to respond. He didn't want to give false hope, but he also didn't want to close the door completely. Lillian had been a part of his life for so long, and he couldn't ignore the connection they had once shared. But Abigail's safety was his priority now. It had to be. "I can't promise anything right now, Lillian," he finally said. "But I'll think about it. I'll think about what's best for Abigail." Lillian didn't say anything for a moment. When she finally spoke again, her voice was soft. "I'll respect that, William. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry." The conversation ended there, and William put his phone down, feeling a strange sense of closure. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was the first step toward something better for all of them. Days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely William started to see a change in Abigail. She smiled more, and though there were still moments of doubt and fear, they became less frequent. The road to healing wasn't quick and it wasn't easy, but they were making progress. As for Lillian, she kept her distance. There were no more calls, no more attempts to reconcile. William wasn't sure what her next step would be, but for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace with the decisions he had made. The past could not be undone, but the future was theirs to shape. William had learned that sometimes moving forward meant leaving the past behind, no matter how painful that might be. And for Abigail, for the little girl he loved more than anything, he would do whatever it took to make sure she never had to fear again. The days following the therapy sessions began to weave a sense of normalcy back into William and Abigail's lives. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress, and for the first time in months, William felt a flicker of hope. Every day there was a new small step, Abigail laughing at a joke, holding his hand tighter when they walked to school, or even sitting at the dinner table without the heavy silence that used to hang between them. It wasn't that the pain was gone or that the past had been forgotten, but they were learning to live with it, learning to move past it, one day at a time. The weeks passed in a blur. Winter turned to spring, and the weather shifted from cold gray skies to warm afternoons filled with sunlight. Abigail's smile grew more frequent, though there were still moments when she withdrew, her mind wandering back to darker memories, but she was trying. And William was there, doing everything he could to help her heal, even if he wasn't sure how to heal himself. It was during one of these quiet evenings that a knock on the door startled William. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the timing was odd, just as he had sat down to read Abigail her bedtime story. When he opened the door, his heart skipped a beat. Standing there, with her arms folded tightly across her chest, was Lillian. For a moment they both stood in silence, as if neither of them quite knew what to say. The woman who had been his wife, the mother of his child, was now standing on his doorstep, a long way from the person he had once known. "William," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to talk about everything, about Abigail, about us." William's first instinct was to close the door, but something stopped him. He had spent months wrestling with his feelings, with the lies, the betrayal, and the anger. He had thought he was done with it all, that he could finally move on. But the truth was there was still so much unresolved between them. And despite everything, he couldn't just pretend that wasn't the case. He stepped aside, allowing her into the house. Abigail was already tucked in for the night, and though he'd rather not have this conversation with his daughter asleep upstairs, he knew that avoidance wouldn't bring closure. "I don't know what you want, Lillian," he said, his voice steady but tired. "You've had your chance. You've hurt Abigail in ways I don't think I can forgive, and that's not something that just goes away." "I know," she replied, her eyes filled with regret. "I know. I've spent every day regretting it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect us to be able to move forward in any way. But I need you to know I am trying to make things right with her." William sighed deeply, running his hand through his hair. He had heard these words before, and they always sounded so empty, so hollow, coming from her. But this time there was something different. It wasn't just guilt in her eyes, it was determination. Lillian was struggling, but it seemed that for the first time in years she was taking responsibility for her actions. "Why now?" William asked, his tone softer than he expected. "Why come back now?" Lillian's hands clenched. "Because I'm terrified. Terrified that if I don't try, I will lose her forever. And that would be the worst punishment I could ever face. I don't deserve her, but she deserves a chance to heal. And I have to do whatever it takes to help her." For a moment the room fell silent. The weight of what she was saying lingered in the air. William had to admit there was sincerity in her words. But sincerity wasn't enough. Not after everything that had happened. "I don't know if I can let you back in, Lillian," William said finally, his voice shaking slightly. "You've caused so much damage, and you're not the person I thought you were." "I'm not," she agreed quietly, "but I'm willing to prove that I can change. I want to show you, and I want to show Abigail, that I am still capable of being the person you thought I was. I'll do whatever it takes." William stared at her for a long time, the anger and betrayal still simmering beneath the surface. But there was something else there now, an understanding that perhaps this was not about him anymore. This wasn't about what he could forgive. This was about what Abigail needed. And perhaps, despite everything, Abigail deserved a chance to have some closure with the woman who had once been her mother. "We'll take this one step at a time," William finally said, his voice measured. "But for now, you have to understand that you've lost a lot. And I can't just give you back everything you had. But we'll see what happens. It's up to Abigail now." Lillian nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I'll do anything. I'll prove it to her, I promise." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a faint glimmer of hope in the room. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, and there was no guarantee of success. But William could see that both he and Lillian were willing to try. As Lillian left that night, William closed the door behind her, standing in the dim light of the hallway, deep in thought. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: his family was changing, and it was up to them to figure out how to move forward together. And so, as the night deepened, William found a small amount of peace in knowing that, no matter how fractured their past had been, there was always the possibility for healing. Whether it was through forgiveness or through time, the cracks could heal and new memories could be forged. But the journey was far from over.